This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Enemy Feminisms, TERFs, Police Women, and Girl Bosses Against Liberation by Sophie Lewis, former and also future guest of the pod. In this unflinching tour of 200 years of enemy feminisms, from 19th century imperialist feminists and cops to 20th century KKK feminists and pornophobes to today's anti-abortion and TERF feminists, writer and critic Sophie Lewis argues, with characteristic verve and eloquence, that we must reckon with what Western feminism has wrought if we have any hope of winning the liberatory feminist politics we need. As Judith Butler puts it, this book is mandatory reading for anyone interested in a rough and compelling vision of the feminist past, present, and future. Honest, brutal, historically comprehensive, and brilliant. Find Enemy Feminisms at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. The Trump administration and the DOGE blitzkrieg gets unleashed upon the administrative state has been justified in the name of efficiency, and also of stomping out all things DEI and woke. Really, when it comes to MAGA, everything about this full-scale reactionary class war from above has been justified in the name of fighting what they deem to be the perversities of DEI and woke. Absolutely bankrupt forms of liberal identity politics very much laid the groundwork for this racist oligarchic reaction. But whatever the very serious problems with liberal identity politics, it's a huge, and to me pretty obvious mistake for anyone on the left to be cheering on what's happening right now. Today, I'm interviewing Femi Táíwò, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, and Mike McCarthy. A few quick thoughts before we get started. Racism has been a constant organizing principle of social and economic life in the United States. But after the classic civil rights movement defeated formal segregation and Jim Crow, we entered a contradictory period dominated by racial liberalism. Racial liberalism rendered certain overt forms of racism taboo and protected formal civil rights. Racial liberalism did all that, but also, through the demonization of poor black people, facilitated the rise of mass incarceration and the destruction of welfare and public housing. But here we are, after the end of the Cold War, amid a crisis of liberalism sparked by a crisis in neoliberalism, in the political rubble of the War on Terror, amid a decade and a half uneven and limited revival of the American left, and at the beginning of Trump's second term. This is the context in which we today have the far right echoing pre-civil rights era forms of the most absolutely open and explicit forms of white supremacy. Take Pete Hegseth's Islamophobic crusaderism, or Acting Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy Darren Beattie, an open, enthusiastic advocate of eugenic population policy. Then there's Trump's policy towards South Africa, attacking the post-apartheid government for purportedly oppressing Afrikaners. A brazen far-right apartheid nostalgia conspiracy theory. And then prioritizing white South Africans for entry as refugees into the United States. The left has asserted that Israel is like apartheid South Africa. The right now suggests, well, apartheid South Africa was good, actually. Finally, well, not finally, I could go on and on and on, but finally, for the purposes of this introduction, finally, there's Musk and J.D. Vance defending one of the adolescent racist DOGE employees after it was discovered that he had posted about his opposition to marrying outside his ethnicity and saying that we should, quote, normalize Indian hate. J.D. Vance's wife is Indian. These people are so messed up. This, after Musk made an absolutely open series of Nazi salutes during the inauguration and then played cute about it. And then Bannon, just the other day, likewise extended his arm, just so. Yet, this is not simply a cut-and-paste resurgence of some past pre-civil rights era racist form. It's not as though, as some liberals might imagine it, it's not as though it had been frozen in the permafrost only to be revivified by MAGA's white heat. For one thing, at the same time as we're seeing this unapologetically brazen racism, parts of the far right are also making a strong pitch for multiracial inclusion. Or at least they were pretty recently on the campaign trail. At this moment of resurgent and brazen racism and social reaction, we must watch out for the ways that the far right seeks to expand its coalition. They want to appeal to young men of color through conservative gender politics, and also by way of crypto and passive income-oriented forms of identification that promise release from wage labor hell to the elect who successfully win the hustle through entrepreneurship and scam artistry. They seek to appeal to Asians through attacks on affirmative action, particularly in high school and higher education. And then there's the muscular, militarist, imperialist nationalism, which in its most expansive forms welcomes a heterogeneous citizenry into its civilizational project. This multiracial nationalist politics is where Steve Bannon sees the possibility for a permanent multiracial far-right majority. But the contradictions will likely prove too daunting for Bannon to navigate. The far right would require the provision of a modicum of social welfare to bind such a coalition together. Clearly, that's something that the billionaire reactionaries running MAGA won't be eager to allow. But most of all, the right depends upon its ability to exploit the contradictions of a liberalism that promises recognition but denies substantive liberation. This all points to a big problem with the sort of liberal identity politics that put its faith in demographic change combined with Republican racism somehow guaranteeing a permanent Democratic majority. In fact, people's identities and ideologies and perceived interests, they're far more complex and contingent than that. Class composition is a project, and a contested one. It's the left's task to make it a project that can successfully stitch together different layers of a complexly structured working class around a project of solidarity and collective liberation. Before we get started, The Dig, this podcast, it's a nonprofit political education project dedicated to sharing ruthless criticism of all that exists with everyone out there who is struggling to change everything. That's why we put out every episode with no paywall. We want every single person possible to listen, very much including those of you who can't afford to contribute. But that's only possible because listeners who can afford to contribute do so at patreon.com/thedig. We send every contributor our excellent occasional newsletter by email. And if you contribute enough and live in the USA, we will send you books, tote bags, and coffee mugs in the mail. If you live elsewhere, depending on how much you donate, we will send you ebooks. But the real reason I'm asking you to contribute is because if you depend on this podcast, please understand that we likewise depend upon you. Please contribute now. That's patreon.com/thedig. Okay, here's Femi Táíwò, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, and Mike McCarthy. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is the co-founder of Hammer and Hope, a digital magazine of race, culture, and politics. She's also the author of From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, and a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Olúfẹ Táíwò is professor of philosophy at Georgetown University and an editor at Hammer and Hope. He's the author of Reconsidering Reparations and Elite Capture. Mike McCarthy is the director of community studies and professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His most recent book, The Master's Tools: How Finance Wrecked Democracy and a Radical Plan to Rebuild It, was just released with Verso Books. Femi Táíwò, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, and Mike McCarthy, welcome to The Dig. And Femi and Keeanga, welcome back.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we should start this conversation by being clear about two things. First, that a lot of the sort of identity politics we've seen from corporations, from liberal politicians, on elite college campuses, and also in some left-wing spaces, we can agree, stipulate that there are various discourses, practices that range from annoying to damaging. But second, that also, and more importantly, that we can agree that racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, that these are all very powerful forces in American society. So, yeah, just to frame out our larger discussion, I want to start by asking, need these two things be so hard to hold in one's head simultaneously?
Well, I was just going to start with the actual issue at hand. What was the point of the DEI bonanza in 2020? And now what is the point of its destruction 5 years later? And so I think on some level, it's obvious that corporations like Apple, Amazon, Whole Foods embraced these varying initiatives around DEI to basically get out of the way of the ire of protests. I think it's important to always remember that these were historic protests in 2020, what the New York Times estimated to be upwards of 26 million people in the streets. And so, there was an obvious effort, as there was in the 1960s. What they called it then was socioeconomic capitalism, capitalism with a conscience. These were efforts to avoid boycotts, to avoid protests, and to make it seem as if the largest corporations in America were on the side of Black people. Some went even further in ways that you could see how there was also a realization that DEI could be profitable for them. JP Morgan Chase, one of the reasons why they have continued with their DEI initiatives, despite the pressure to jettison them, is because mostly these are loans that they agree to make. They agree to expand their, low-income homeownership portfolio. And so I think the 50 largest corporations in the United States made $50 billion in pledges to do a variety of diversity initiatives. So that was obviously one manifestation of the DEI bonanza. But that wasn't all of it. Most of the efforts have been centered around workplace culture, how to create what they describe as a more equitable workplace. And, that is where some of the kind of conflicting issues, I think, with DEI are legitimate and raise important issues and questions that we shouldn't kind of avoid talking about. But I think sometimes what gets lost is that this is in reaction to real issues, right? This is in reaction to real racism in the workforce and on college campuses, which is one of the reasons why I think that given the relentless assault on these kinds of initiatives, they're actually not unpopular, right? If you look at Gallup Pew polling, adults in the United States, a majority of whom support businesses having diversity initiatives. And so I think that all has to be a part of the discussion. Real racism, that these are in reaction to, just like affirmative action was a real response to real racism in society, in workplaces, on college campuses. Do they go far enough? No. But there are plenty of reforms that exist within our society that don't go far enough, that we don't say, thus you should jettison them. Roe v. Wade didn't go far enough. And no one, on the left with any credibility was celebrating its demise because it didn't go far enough and, drove a wedge between men and women in the working class. I mean, it's a ridiculous premise. So, I'll say that to open things up. There's more to say about it, but I think the context is important.
I'll just add one thing to kind of underscore the last point Keeanga just made. I think the argument that DEI, that anti-racist, that, social justice policies in the workplace are suspicious because they don't go far enough just strikes me as a particularly disingenuous kind of argument. For exactly the reason Keeanga just said, right? Like, no one says that about dental, right? No one in any part of the left thinks that the working class is a 5% raise away from dismantling capitalism, right? We fight for things that are less than the full society we want because we value those things, whether it's, dental, whether it's pay raise, whether it's better benefits, and whether it's having less racism at work. And those are all just things that are independently valuable and that we should not confuse with the total victory of the class war. But there's no reason to think that we should replace the total victory of the class war with any of those things.
Yeah, I would just want to add, I think a real puzzle is, why is it that this bundle of things that are actually so completely different from each other have come to have this powerful force in our society politically? Everything from cancel culture to race prioritizing hiring and college admissions to sensitivity training to even, watching a commercial and seeing somebody that appears queer to you and thinking, ooh, that's woke. Like, how is it that all these things in our society have come to have this political salience when we can obviously recognize that they're of all sorts of different sorts, right? And I think it's important to keep in mind the role of liberalism and the Democrats in this story. To me, a key part of the rise of anti-wokeness is precisely the emptiness of liberalism and its own reaction to those movements and protests that Keeanga was mentioning that sparked off in 2020. There's a really fascinating book. It's written by a Japanese Marxist named Tosaka Jun. It's called The Japanese Ideology, published in 1935. Jun was basically the Gramsci of Japan. He was imprisoned under a fascist regime. He died because of his treatment in prison. But he wrote this book, and basically he argues that liberalism, it has basically three forms. It has an economic form, a political form, and a cultural form. The economic and political are basically about sort of, freeness from the state, political, or freeness in the economy. And when economic liberalism doesn't have legitimacy or salience, it can sometimes persist in its cultural form. And its cultural form is all about sentimentality and kind of empty ideas about the individual's freeness to identify themselves. What's interesting about this book, and why I think it's actually relevant to this discussion, is that after the protests kicked off, the response and the way they were integrated into political discourse by the Democrats and by liberals was in a declassed and a defanged way that presented them as simply a sort of free expression of people's individuality and their own identity. And I think this kind of empty space, this empty reaction that liberalism had to Black Lives Matter created the context for the right to kind of subvert it and to turn this into like a politically salient and powerful issue in politics. It was precisely that emptiness of the Democrats in their response to Black Lives Matter that created the grounds for the right to sort of repurpose this. And so I think we really need to think serious about, like, why is it that wokeness is even a thing? Like, why can somebody say that and we can kind of associate that with this bundle of very different sorts of things? And I think, again, we have to tie that in some way to the failure of liberalism.
That's exactly where I want to go right now, that we're seeing woke and DEI becoming central motifs invoked to legitimate a wide swath of this authoritarian MAGA blitzkrieg that's underway right now in D.C. And I want to get more into the historical context, but just starting with what's happening right now. How are we seeing woke and DEI being invoked from everything from the gutting of USAID and the EEOC, countless federal agencies, to why Kendrick Lamar performed at the Super Bowl halftime show, to why an aviation disaster took place at National Airport, to why the LA fires happened? What is this work that woke and DEI are doing across these incredibly disparate sorts of events and contexts? Why is it able to do so much work in so many different sorts of places?
I think in some ways it is the ideological banner of the right now. And so it's the framing, the cultural framing to make sense of politics generally. It's emerged as essentially the key lens to understand a whole variety of social ills and social problems. And kind of going back to what I was saying before, that was made possible by the failure of liberalism. Liberals have kind of helped create this kind of distorted worldview that is now kind of the rallying cry of the right.
Yeah, and I think one half of it is the point Mike's made over these last couple comments, right? They're seizing on a real failure on the side of the Democratic Party and the center left to connect the sense of values that they communicate with the kneeling in the kente cloth and, and all the kind of symbolism to a concrete set of actual political actions. One second they're calling Trump a fascist, the next they're gleefully handing power to him, right? So there's a real disconnect. There's a real weakness of liberalism and the center in this country that the right are seizing upon. But they're also, I think, just as importantly, managing to seize on a weakness of their own, and managing to convert that into a strength. I think one of the big features of the last sort of era of politics, this generation that we're in, that Doug Henwood has written a bit about, is a kind of lack of political historical vision from the ruling class as a whole, right? What DEI substitutes for is really having any answers for the actual historical crises that we're in. Like, the right doesn't have any ideas about what to actually do about airplane safety. They don't have any ideas about what to do about climate change. They don't have any ideas about really, in a serious way, how to respond to the geopolitical security crisis that Russia represents. What they have are a bunch of clever, well-honed kind of scapegoating tactics that substitute for having any actual ideas about how to govern. And what they have is an audience of people that have been conditioned not to have or even want answers, right? They want people to blame. It's not clear that they want any actual solutions or, even on, the crudest, most cynical policy terms to any of these actual problems.
So I guess I would say that this is actually more determined than that. I do think that the right doesn't have a particular plan to address the issues that they ran on, right? So inflation and insecurity and all of the things that Trump masterfully manipulated, they have no resolution to. But I don't think that this is just a smokescreen. I don't think that this is just a distraction in the usual way that we think about the kind of divide and conquer politics of the right. I do think that this is the culmination of a decades-long effort by the right to do a few things. One is to denude racism of any real meaning, which has been a long project from the right, first in a very ham-fisted way, in the early parts of the civil rights movement, where they embraced a kind of open racism and derision of Black people. And then the shift in the late 1960s and 1970s to colorblindness and to functioning with race outside of the law, to still come back to this issue of impugning Black people in particular for their own conditions of poverty, which is connected to the next objective, which is the dismantling of the welfare state in particular. And so we know that the right is not anti-statist. The biggest qualms are with the social welfare state. They love the war state, they love the police state, they love the business state. It's the social welfare state that is the problem. And they use and have used racism from Reconstruction to now as a way to undermine a welfare state that provides for both Black and white people, and now brown people, women as well. But racism, anti-Black racism, is always the Trojan horse for the white, for the right, to enter into these discussions. And so Project 2025 is not a newfangled invention of the right. The Heritage Foundation, I believe, was founded in 1973. It is the, inheritor of Buckley's earlier legacy of conservatism. And this has been a part of a strategy for 5 or 6 decades that has ebbed and flowed in its, success, less success. And this presented an opening. And what is the this that presented the opening? I think the way that anti-racist politics have devolved from a kind of big left objective to the kind of individual initiative of people based on policing individual behavior. So in many ways, the woke DEI, the way that it expresses itself, mimics the kind of worst politics of the left, which is anti-racism is about you, and it's about how you respond to people. It's about changing your individual self. It's about being self-reflective. And so, of course, sometimes some of that is necessary. I was talking to a friend of mine who was relaying that someone that she knows works at a law firm, and the extent of their DEI was telling white people not to touch Black people's hair. It, of course, sounds ridiculous, but then it's like, but sometimes those white people need to hear that. Like, stop touching people's hair. Like before I went to graduate school, and the reason why I went to graduate school is because I worked for a liberal lawyer, white man in Chicago, and in a fit of rage after a court appearance, we're driving back to Chicago. We had been to court in the suburbs. He begins to explain to me that there is a difference between niggers and Black people. This is a liberal white lawyer who defends tenants when he's not making racial slurs. And so it's real, like at work, where people just say crazy racist shit. And so I don't have any qualms with trying to create an environment where that is just not permissible. But to think that that is the extent of what it means to actually confront racism is not just, I mean, it's obviously a deep reflection of liberalism, but it's also a reflection of how the premises of liberalism have come to usurp the much bigger, broader vision of what the left used to have in this country, and has been replaced by this kind of individual initiative. And so the right has exploited this by picking up on the resentments of people being individually told by their employer to change their behavior, to change how they interact with people at work, to change how they think, right? This is why this is an opening that can be exploited. But I don't think that it's just about smoke screens and distractions, but that this is part of the right's long war on the social welfare state. They want to undermine that. They have always had racism at the center of those efforts to undermine that. And this is an opportunity, a crisis, if you will, that they have refused to squander. They are taking advantage of it.
Keeanga, you put this really hilariously and well in a group chat, and I'm sharing this with your permission. Quote, "If my boss told me to interrogate my whiteness, I would tell them to fuck off. But that's only part of what's happening."
Exactly.
Yeah.
No one wants to feel policed by the person who's paying them because it feels manipulative. People don't want to be perceived as racist. People don't want to be perceived as oppressors. And there's something about your boss being at the helm of this process that raises, all kinds of political issues. But the aspect of there's more happening is important because none of that has anything to do with what the right's doing.
Yeah, I want to build on that a little bit because I think Keeanga's point about the right is so fundamental. I guess I don't know if this is a disagreement or if it's just kind of an elaboration, but it seems to me the past decade or so, the right's kind of hegemonic project to justify the ruling class through this racial frame has really experienced a significant delegitimization in American culture. And I think it's been undermined significantly precisely by those movements that emerged that have reshaped how people think about race. And that both the economic project of the right after Occupy Wall Street is kind of lost its appeal, but also the cultural project of the right. It suffered massive pushback and kind of fractures. You can actually see that in the disorientation and disorganization of the elite. I think the ruling class in the past 5 to 10 years has been confused and disorganized when it comes to cultural issues. They've had no problem when it comes to making money. But I think in some ways, that's what this woke blowback is kind of responding to. It's responding to this cultural disorganization. The ruling class want to be able to say, they want to be able to justify the fact that their wealth comes through exploitation, but they also want to feel good about themselves, and they want to feel good about who they are, and they want to feel good about being, men and being masculine and all this crap. And I think that pushback and the sort of vehemence in which we see it is precisely because that they've lost legitimacy in the past. And I think it's interesting. Right at a moment where all these books about woke are coming out and all these anti-woke books are coming out and anti-DEI stuff is, driving politics in key ways. We're at a moment, I think, where actually these concepts, the right's already won on these points. Like wokeness itself doesn't have any political salience for the left anymore. I kind of asked my class the other day, I have a class of 25 UC Santa Cruz students, about as liberal as you can get. I asked them in class, I polled them, who in here would describe yourself as woke? Literally none of them, right? All of them were like, no, this isn't a concept that we use. And it's not because they're on the right. It's because the concept doesn't have social legitimacy in a way that it might have 5 years ago. And even when if you look at sort of how DEI issues and executives are talking about these issues in the firm, there's been an absolute collapse. It's basically not used anymore. DEI is, as a kind of rhetorical justification, increasingly kind of going by the wayside. I think in some ways, what we've seen over the past 5 years, to kind of reconnect this to Keeanga's point, is a little sort of dip in the legitimacy of the ruling class. And they have quickly rearticulated their project. And I think we're kind of seeing the emergence of a kind of a new frame to legitimize and to justify their extraordinary wealth and extraordinary extraction.
I really agree with that. If we think about the last, I don't know, since 2008, how long is that? 17 years, that we have been in a period of expanding radicalization. And you think about how the economic crisis of 2008, that none of my students even know was a thing, it cracked open the logics, the prevailing logics of the world in utterly profound ways. And so, if you think about how just a few years before the economic crisis, how Black people in New Orleans were blamed for their own poverty, were blamed for not evacuating during Hurricane Katrina, and that this was part of a prevailing logic in mainstream bipartisan political discourse, the kind of hangover from the welfare discourse of the Democratic Party and the Republicans in the mid 1990s that ends up with the destruction of welfare as an entitlement led by the Republicans and then taken up by Bill Clinton in 1996. And the financial crisis really obliterates that worldview, that poverty is caused by the excesses of the poor. It revealed that poverty and the threat to global stability were a bunch of reckless, greedy bankers. And then it is further delegitimized when the federal government bends over backwards to rescue them with this logic that they are too big to fail and having nothing substantive for people whose lives were destroyed by this financial crisis, mostly in the form of losing their homes, losing their asset, their investment, the stake they had in this society. And it cracked open the space for the development of Occupy Wall Street. Piketty's book on capital becomes a kind of common language to understand, expressed through the Occupy Wall Street slogan about the 1%, which then also creates the space for the emergence of Black Lives Matter, which upends the discussion about post-racialism and connects Black inequality and racism to capitalism and to the excesses and the inequality of American capitalism. It totally transformed the political ground upon which everyone was standing. And I think that the high point of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 is not just about police violence, although obviously that was a central catalyzing issue, but it was also, again, about the ineptitude of the ruling class in response to the pandemic, right? That was also a focal point of those protests. Why are Black people dying at such an exponential rate? But also, what is this essential worker nonsense, right? Calling people essential workers to force them to go out and be vulnerable to an airborne disease, but not paying them as if they were essential workers. How is it that we have a military that can pinpoint bombs in a Pakistani wedding party, but somehow we can't make sure that Michigan has ventilators? Somehow we can't make sure nurses in New York have masks and have aprons. Like what is going on? And so the protests were about the racism and cruelty of police, but also about the ineptitude of the state. And I think the fact that millions of young white people were on those demonstrations, sometimes in places where there are no Black people, in Portland, Maine, in Boise, Idaho, sent a message to at least some layer of the ruling class that we gotta get the narrative back. And Scott Walker said it, the former right-wing governor of Wisconsin. Our youth have been indoctrinated in this woke, multicultural grievance studies that are polluting our universities. If we don't get them back, we will never win another election. And so that is why we have to understand the attacks on history, on book bans, on curriculum, on schools as in tandem with the attacks on workers, the attacks on the social welfare state, which is why it is so dangerous for people on our side to be entertaining that there's something good in not the collapse of DEI. If it was collapsing under its own weight, then that would be another thing to talk about. But this is a concerted effort to use racism to undermine the idea of racism as having any explanatory force in our society, of basically saying anytime you see a Black worker, whether it's at Starbucks, in a control tower, whether it's at Harvard University, or whether it's at your local community college, they don't deserve to be there. They have replaced a more competent white person, and you should be suspicious of them. What does that do to the damn class struggle? As well as reinforcing ideas among white workers that the real problems that they face are not the rich, is not a billionaire selectively deciding which program should stay and which should go, but is of Black workers, is of Latino workers, and is of Muslims. Of course, we have to take on this as a racist attack.
Let's talk more about education because, of course, woke and various synonyms have long been invoked from states like Florida to the federal level to attack education, particularly, not particularly higher education, all education, K through 12 and higher ed in different ways. But for years, in terms of higher ed, the far right attack has been really focused on dismantling the humanities and fields, woke fields like gender studies, and also just generalized curricular censorship, austerity, and privatization. But now, in the last few weeks, somewhat surprisingly to me at least, this gutting of the administrative state has led to huge, sudden cuts to STEM, a real crisis for scientific research all over the country. What's weird about this to me is that STEM had been valorized in contrast to the purportedly woke and soft sciences and humanities. And now they're suddenly on the chopping block big time. What does dismantling universities as we knew them, where does that fit into the far right culture war? And what does it mean that it's suddenly extended to the hard sciences?
Not that the right has ever been especially subtle, but we are in a loud mask off moment along the lines that Keeanga was just saying, right? You know, whatever it is that you think you mean by opposition to DEI, wokeness, there is a particular thing that the right means by that, and it is visible in the character of the politics that they're pushing now. One development I was sharing with everybody here is the bill that's been advanced in the Ohio Senate this past week, which would outlaw DEI offices and scholarships, and also outlaw strikes by full-time faculty. The underlying through line, of course, being we want power, right? And we, being the imperious right, have a broad conception of what power is, arguably as broad as ours, right? They want to control what information is thought of, is valorized, is promoted. And so this same bill not only bans DEI, but it also calls for post-tenure reviews so they can undermine faculty protections that might keep other political perspectives around. It would go as far as making institutional statements that the bill deems politically controversial. So that would not only include DEI, but foreign policy, electoral politics, immigration, marriage, abortion, and climate policy. All of those are specifically named by this legislation. You know, it is a full on authoritarian crackdown. And that is the underlying logic behind union busting as well. These people will burn money to make sure that they don't have to share power with workers. It's not, you know, that is how the class war has traditionally been understood. You know, not just for profit, but also for control over the workplace, over production, over social life that is organized by production. And that's how they understand it. And they're being very clear about that now.
You know, this isn't just the robber barons who are trying to squeeze every nickel out of every human being. But if there is an ideological force that is underwriting this, it's Christian nationalism. And so that's why we get the kind of, you know, capitalist bludgeon on the working class and working class living standards and programs and all of that. But it comes with anti-science, right? I mean, the Senate just confirmed Robert F. Kennedy, the anti-vaccine eugenicist kook, to be in charge of the $2 trillion budget for health and human services. This is the idea that the right is concerned about meritocracy and qualification is just treated absurdly in this moment. They're literally mocking the idea. But I think that the Christian nationalism explains some aspects of the anti-science parts of this, the intense, extraordinary homophobia and anti-trans agenda, which I think is just the opening. I think they will try to repeal equal marriage for LGBT couples. Obviously, before it's all said and done, they will impose a national ban on abortion. It might not be the first thing that they do, but I think before they lose their majority, they will try to impose that. It's an attack on anything that does not resemble the nuclear family. There were reports that the new head, I can't remember his name, of the DOT, Department of Transportation, wants to tie funding to communities that have high birth rates and high rates of traditional marriage. So that is also an aspect of what their political agenda is, and also why they want to attack schools. It's not just the undermining of the quote unquote indoctrination, but it's also advancing another kind of education that you can see embodied in like the 1776 Commission report, these executive orders that decry one form of politics in the classroom while promoting a different form.
We can't undersell the fact that the right isn't just trying to attack things, they're trying to build things. They have a positive vision. They have an alternative. In the university, they want to recognize, nationalist, patriotic, America first interpretations of history, and they're absolutely clear about that. They want to recognize traditional family values. They want to recognize, to bring back basically ideas that have been delegitimized, and I think that's absolutely essential. I want to go back to a point Femi made as well. We need to put front and center how anti-worker this project is. The anti-DEI project is fundamentally an anti-worker project. We're going to see that within the universities. We are already seeing that at the level of federal workers who are being fired. We are seeing that in workplaces where people are being fired out of DEI positions, and these are overwhelmingly people of color, by the way. There are these ideas that, oh, well, this is just the middle class. It doesn't matter. This doesn't actually have any effect. If you look at the sociological research on the Black family in the U.S., There's some great research by folks like Mary Patillo and others who basically show that Black families are, with Black middle class individuals are much, much more likely to have people in their families that are impoverished. And those individuals oftentimes give money to those family members to help them. And poverty and class are like intertwined in ways that it's just not true of other groups in the US. So when people on the left say, oh, this is just PMC politics, this doesn't matter. This doesn't matter for the working class. It's not an accurate view of what the Black family looks like in the United States, and the way in which wealth is moved around the Black family in order to support people who are impoverished. We need to have like a broader view of this stuff. And yeah, just to kind of go back to the point about the anti-woke left, I think it's really, really dangerous and extremely concerning that we have such a significant current of people on the left in the United States that are cheering this on. To me, it is a complete rejection of left values, of the idea of solidarity, of the idea of common support for workers. And I think a lot of it's a politics that is so internal to the university and university spaces, and is so disconnected in some ways from actual worker struggles. I really want to push back against that because I'm concerned with it, and I think it's a dangerous trend.
There are a certain subset of elite university left anti-woke professors whose entire politics seems to be defined by fellow elite university purportedly woke professors who drive them insane. And that's their like entire worldview.
It's just a matter of not liking your coworkers, I think.
And it's really bizarre on the merits, right? Because we're in an era where the president is like a real estate trust fund kid. The real actual president is the richest person in the world. You know, it's never been easier to make the case for class first politics and the centrality of capital to understanding politics. And there's just a contingent of people that is just refuses to take the W and is just like snatching defeat out of the jaws of victory by fighting yesterday's intra-left weird culture war between academic departments, and just won't look at the actual conjuncture. And I don't know what's going on there, but it's weird.
I think Mike is making a really important point. One, about the ways that the experience of Black middle class people is not the same as what we might describe as a white middle class experience. It's quite shallow. It's extremely fragile because of the proximity of Black middle class people to the Black poor, often in the same neighborhood, because of residential segregation that continues to persist through redlining, but also through the family itself. And so any idea that these are just middle class positions and are somehow superfluous is kind of insidious on its own terms, but is really missing the way that this is ideologically being wielded to raise suspicion about all Black workers, undermining the solidarity between all workers by creating and raising suspicion about who belongs and who doesn't belong. And it's a politics that we should actually be arguing fervently against, no matter what class is affected, right? The tribune of the oppressed, understanding that racism, no matter who it's directed at, has a much broader social appeal. And that's why when Barack Obama is subjected to birtherism and other kinds of racist invective, the point is not to then stand back and say, well, he deserves it. The point is to challenge the ideas of racism anywhere they present themselves in our society, because it is antithetical to the politics of solidarity and unity that is necessary to move from what is it, a class of itself to a class for itself. And so that to me is one aspect of this that has to be taken seriously. Just the last thing about the university is, I think that what Mike says about the right has a vision and a plan for what they're doing is absolutely true. And if that means shrinking the university back to a kind of its classical liberal phase before the dirty herds, the dirty masses were allowed open entry, then that is something that we need to do. I think that their kind of perverse vision of destroying the administrative state as a way to starve the beast, what Musk is now calling the parasite class, meaning anyone who is using the services of the state as part of the enemy, is all part of this. And they said this, in the days before the election, that, this will be painful. This reordering that we envision ourselves being able to enact will be painful, but will be lucrative in the long run. This is straight class war. This is straight class war. Shrink the colleges and universities, engorge the working class, the poor, declassed people. This is who will replace the immigrants that we absolutely, in the name of white Christian nationalism, want to drive out. This will create their replacements, repopulate the jails, will make them work too. And we will use, AI and all these other technological devices to fill in the gaps. And if some planes have to crash and some doors have to close and some food poisoning has to commence and some tuberculosis has to spread, then so be it. Because as Musk said a few days ago, this is our one shot. This is our one opportunity. You can't be afraid. And this is the problem with the so-called opposition of the Democratic Party. Here you see the inventiveness, the audaciousness, the really bold thinking of the right. And the Democrats they're so institutionalized that they literally think that the system can't break and that they can play the usual games that they've played. Oh, people will see how bad it's getting and come to their senses, and this will be good discipline for our base. As Cory Booker said on a live presser 2 days ago, elections have consequences, with a slight smirk, right? They are playing yesterday's game. And so, these are important questions and times for the left about how are we going to reconsolidate our forces, because one of the lessons from 2020 is that movements don't win because they should. They don't win just because they're morally superior to their opposition. And we had a moment, but without the political tools to really take advantage of that, to win anything substantive. I mean, the lasting residue of 2020 is Juneteenth, is a lynching bill that was 60 years too late, and that's it. And they might even cancel Juneteenth this year. And then what do we have? We won't have anything as a victory from them. And so this raises huge questions for what the left is, what it wants to be, how does it organize itself to resist this situation? And at the heart of that, are questions about ideology and politics and what we have to say about racism. It's an unavoidable argument in the United States. You can avoid it maybe in Sweden. Maybe you don't need to take it up, but you probably do because of the porous borders now. But in the US, you can't be a left without anti-racist politics. There is no historical precedent. And it doesn't even matter if I don't want to fight against racism, it's divisive. It doesn't matter because Black people will fight. These attacks are directed at Black people. Black people will fight. And so then the question will be, are you fighting alongside them or are you ignoring their struggle? And in that way, you become entangled in the racist or anti-racist politics, whether you like it or not. That's the country we live in. It's a country of immigrants. It's a country of formerly enslaved people. There have to be racial politics.
I think it's really important at this point that Keeanga, you made, Mike made, about the racialized class war from above nature of the way that woke and DEI are now so powerfully resonant in the attack on the administrative state and the federal bureaucracy. This resonates because both the federal bureaucracy and wokeness are identified not just with the despised liberal professional managerial class, but particularly the female PMC, and even more particularly the Black female PMC. And this demonization of Black women is always core to attacks on the public sector and public sector unions.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to contend with as Musk and his cronies hollow out the administrative state is what the administrative state actually is, right? And it goes back to earlier what Keeanga was saying about which versions of the state the right doesn't like, right? They like the war state. They like the bits that protect capital. They like the bits that expand incarceration. CoreCivic, a massive private prison company, is meeting every day with the Trump administration and already rolling out a $40 million renovation project, which is anticipating Trump delivering on the mass deportation plans. The CEO is saying how he's more excited than he's ever been in his whole career in an article in The Intercept, right? So there are parts of the state that even the right wants to keep around, but the bits that they're dismantling, the welfare state bits, the fallout from that has a racial character to it. 1 in 5 Black workers are employed by the public sector in this country. Something like 20% of federal workers are Black, which is a much higher percentage of the federal workforce than Blacks represent in the population. And, I live in DC where this is especially visible. There are whole ass counties built off of the possibilities for economic opportunity that the federal workforce provides a unique opportunity for economic life in the United States. And this hasn't been missed by the relevant unions. The national secretary of the AFG, the American Federation of Government Employees, one of the reasons he's stated for fighting Project 2025 is the dependence of the Black middle class and Black life in the DMV on access to the government workforce, right? I think the right wing knows this. This is part of why they're fighting against the administrative state. This is part of why they're fighting against home rule in DC. There is a attempt to subjugate all workers. There's a special attempt to subjugate Black workers, and that's part of why the first executive orders from the Trump administration was rolling out, dismantling previous executive orders that institutionalized anti-discrimination measures. There was one executive order in particular that rolled back anti-discrimination in government contracting, which is a $100 billion chunk of the public budget. So we're seeing a full court press against worker rights, against the working class, and the Black working class is a central target in that struggle.
Keeanga, you mentioned Christian nationalism earlier, and Mike, I saw that you have Melinda Cooper's wonderful book, Family Values, on your desk, and that book is all about the fundamental imbrication of social and economic reaction. And I think something that's been really notable is that we've seen this exuberant executive enthusiasm for ditching DEI and wokeism in the workplace. And there are many examples. One in particular that comes to mind is Mark Zuckerberg, who went on Joe Rogan recently and said that corporations needed more, quote, masculine energy because corporations were becoming, quote, culturally neutered. I think having a culture that celebrates the aggression a bit more has its own merits that are really positive. Zuckerberg said that in his new aesthetic, which you guys have already probably seen, of these like heavy T-shirts and big necklaces. It's really horrible. It's really horrible. But my question is, are these CEOs, overwhelmingly white and male, are they thrilling to this all because it's all about exalting their total impunity and power in the workplace as owners and executives who exercise total and incontestable domination of their workforce? And are they ecstatic about getting any sort of challenge on that impunity out of the way, not just because of the reaffirmation of a purely class-based domination of their workers, but also in the sense of reaffirming their domination as white men, because those are the modalities through which they exercise their class power in the workplace. As white male CEOs, that is how they embody their class power in the workplace.
I think it's really important that a lot of these economic spaces where we've been having fightbacks are precisely the spaces where the elite have felt culturally neutered, to put it back into terms that connect up to masculinity.
He said it.
Oh yeah, right. Exactly. And what it is, it's an expression of actually winning the economic fights. Like they feel emboldened. They feel in a way sort of that they're past this moment in which they are being sort of held to a greater level of scrutiny that they have in our past. And I think we can see this in a lot of different areas. It's no surprise to me that issues like ESG in investing have experienced a major backlash by the Trump administration. For folks that don't know, ESG is environment, social, and governance. It's basically investing norms, financial investing that's like pro-environment and things like that. And it's basically trying to respond in different ways to environmental justice movements, trying to reshape how we invest. But it's for ESG, for instance, think about where the politics have been on the U.S. campuses over the past years. They've been politics around the genocide in Palestine. And those politics have been manifested in fightbacks that are about university endowments, that are about how universities invest. And the elite understand that investment and these endowments is a critical space of politics and contentious politics. The encampments that sprung up across the country were precisely about redirecting flows of investment outside of companies that were profiting from the genocide. They understand this. They understand where social movement politics are. And they're winning those fights, right? In the dismantlement of the encampments and the sort of the rollback on ESG, it represents a win for them. It represents a victory. And in the same way, the dismantling of DEI, the dismantling of the cultural significance of wokeness is a victory for them. And it's an opportunity for them to step out in front of us and pump their chest. And that's exactly what's happening. People like Mark Zuckerberg, people like Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, bizarrely have felt under attack. They bizarrely have felt like they're the cultural victims. And they're stepping up right now in this sort of bravado moment because they feel like they're finally winning. I think it represents an actual victory, but it's grand moves about minor inconveniences. That's what's happening. The DEI was always a minor inconvenience, but that minor inconvenience was always way too much. And I think we need to kind of recognize that they are in a moment right now where they feel like they're absolutely on top of the world, not just economically, but also culturally.
I really agree with that. I think that these people have been on the defensive for more than a decade. I think because of the way that liberalism kind of performs action and substantive action with kind of substitutes that with chattering, with symbolic gestures, that it made wokeness or multiculturalism or the sort of affects of anti-racism appear to be in vogue as a discussion point without actually addressing the underlying materiality that is the product of racial discrimination and inequality. But in doing so, that was part of putting these people on the defensive. And I think that, corporations were susceptible to this as well. These were initiatives, programs, ideas imposed on them because of the political climate. And to me, that is why they've so quickly fallen, right? I mean, the people acting as if executive order is law, right? Executive orders are not laws. They may be a particular interpretation of the law, but they aren't laws themselves. But, think about the NCAA within 5 minutes of Trump's executive order about transgender athletes. They're like, oh, yes, we concede. We concede, you know? And it's because 15 years earlier, they were forced. The rise and strength of the LGBT movement that produced marriage, 15 years earlier, meant that the NCAA was forced to change its rules then. They didn't want to, they were forced to. And so when that pressure alleviates itself, and there's, a directive that in other circumstances people challenge the legality of, they're like, oh, yes, we will quickly revert back to the way we wanted things to be. And that's the same across corporate America, that even before Trump is elected, the quick and easy decision to do away with their diversity initiatives because they didn't want them in the first place. They were forced upon them. And so I think that the kind of preening of powerful, rich white men is part of the ideological center of the MAGA movement, right? Make America Great Again, which was when? Which was when wealthy white men ruled without question, that it was the expectation. And so this is an effort to kind of reestablish an older coalition of white supremacy, understanding white supremacy as a political project intending to fuse rich, wealthy white men with working class white men on the presumption of cultural dominance, that this is our country. We are the kings of our castle here, and everyone else must defer to us in substitution of real, substantive, material uplift. It doesn't mean that there aren't some material benefits that come with that, but they're unstable and they're inconsistent and they're not nearly enough, and they won't be nearly enough if you combine the shrinking of colleges and university, if you combine the destruction of the administrative state, and if you combine the conditions that they are creating for a massive transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top. Then the old white supremacist coalition can't really hold together, because there's supposed to be some guarantee as in the uniqueness of the post-war period, right? Of an ever expanding economy. There's supposed to be that trade-off of the family wage, of the quote unquote American dream. This iteration, which is why it's important not to just wildly use historical analogies. Is this the post-Reconstruction? No, we're not in a post-Reconstruction period. No, this is not the new nadir, right? This is not 1915, where hundreds of Black people are being lynched. And if you ask then, should Black people be colonized somewhere else, then 99% of the population would agree with you. This is not that. In the same way that this is not the post-war white supremacist coalition, the too many financial contradictions. This is coming about at a time when the lives and livelihood of ordinary white people is being destroyed through the forces of the deaths by despair. And people recoil at this because, God forbid, you talk about the exploitation and oppression of white working class people, but that's a real phenomenon, right? Drug addiction, opioid addiction, alcoholism, and suicide. Not really the pillars of white privilege, but exposing the fragility of MAGA's attempts to reconstitute a white power, white supremacist coalition. This is not the post-war order. And so these are the contradictions that a coherent left has to exploit. We both have to be anti-racist and be able to articulate a vision for white working class people that does not just dismiss them as being privileged, as being unquestioned Trump supporters, and as being outside of a movement that is necessary to transform the conditions of life in this country. And that requires a serious, mature left that we have to rebuild because we're not there at the moment.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. That was such a good point that Keeanga was making. There's also a way in which I think Trump is playing the kind of role of a Bonaparte figure in this period, essentially presenting himself as the figure of the nation, as a kind of neutral arbiter, in such a way that he's actually reconstituting the ruling class's legitimacy and the ruling class's project in ways that they couldn't do themselves. I mean, think about Zuckerberg 1.0. Not really somebody who was, wearing the heavy chains and the heavy shirts. He didn't really have the kind of swagger that a ruling class figure has. And, the way that these companies were consumed by, in certain ways, a liberal politics of recognition kept them from fully embracing like a ruling class project and kept them in a certain way confined by the cultural victories of Black Lives Matter. And what Trump is doing is actually inverting that and saying, we're going to crush these victories. Yes, they're just cultural, but I want you to thrive culturally too. I want you to dominate in that sphere too. And that's what the project is doing. It's reconstituting the ruling class's cultural domination in addition to its political and its economic domination, which are obvious. And it's in a strange way, and this connects to what Keeanga was saying, he's been able to do that by also winning over a section of the working class. He's done that through a combination of, one, recognition politics to say, yes, the working class deaths of despair, you are valid people. You are the heart of our nation type of politics, but also a redistributive promise that if we build a nativist, anti-immigrant project, you will benefit. You will benefit. And it doesn't matter if our culture is one in which we re-embrace white supremacy. Poor Black workers, poor workers of color are going to benefit from it anyway. And that is something the left needs to take on. We need to have both a mature, sophisticated politics that recognizes the importance of cultural politics, recognition, the value and sort of dignity of people from all different walks of life, but also this built on a redistributive project that knows how to actually win material gains for working class people of all different varieties. And we were in a moment in 2020 when those protests kicked off, when the left, I think, had an opportunity to consolidate around a worker-led movement of Black people in the United States to make demands. And we, I think, in some key ways, failed in that moment. You know, you read all the anti-woke stuff and the characterization of this movement as, just a phenomena of the PMC or of elite cultural institutions like, Columbia University or something like that. I was living in Milwaukee at the time in 2021, and there were massive protests and riots in the city. And those protests were exclusively driven by the poorest neighborhoods in Milwaukee. And they were exclusively driven by the poorest, most oppressed people in Milwaukee, in the zip code that has the highest Black male incarceration rate in the United States. It was a movement of the Black working class. And I think in key ways, we forget that. And so to kind of circle back, the left really needs to embrace a politics that's both a politics of, recognizing the significance of sectional demands within the working class, right? Not dismissing them as identity politics. Because what is class politics if it's not identity politics? I mean, is there any other way of doing politics than through some form of identity? But also kind of having a politics of solidarity that can link those things into a broader struggle. And I think that's where we are currently failing. There's so many that kind of have this vision of class struggle that if it's not just the class as such, mobilized en masse, then it's not real. But it's always subsections of the class that acts. That's what class politics always is.
Class composition is always a work in progress.
Exactly.
And just to add a quick point onto that, that was traditionally very explicitly how it was understood. I don't think Vladimir Lenin is anyone's example of like the most racially focused communist, but even him, in the terms of admission to the Third International, had as one of the criteria for being admitted as a communist party that if you're in a country whose bourgeoisie possesses colonies, you as a party have to have a clear-cut policy in respect of those colonies and oppressed peoples, and you have to support in both deed and word every colonial liberation movement and demand the expulsion of the imperialists. And the point of doing that was to inculcate the kind of internationalist solidarity, cross-class, cross-race, cross-national solidarity that they thought was the bedrock of the communist movement as such. So like the people that are positioning themselves as the gatekeepers of true class politics would not have been admitted on these terms to the Third International. So it's a weird outcrop.
The woke international.
Yeah, the woke international, apparently. What we're seeing now is a weird outcrop of a very specific set of culture war issues that are being read back into the history and the concept of class politics, and they really are not latching on correctly to what's at stake here.
I'm Naomi Klein, and you're listening to The Dig, my go-to podcast for the most thoughtful, in-depth conversation on the left. It's an incredible place to be exposed to new ideas and new writing, and if you can, please become a sustaining supporter at Patreon.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Pluto Press, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Solidarity Betrayed by senior labor activist Ana Avendaño. Unions have criticized Donald Trump and Harvey Weinstein for their blatant sexual abuse practices and the example these powerful men are setting for American workers. But what about the powerful men in the unions themselves? In Solidarity Betrayed, Ana Avendaño, who was fired from United Way Worldwide for speaking up against harassment, exposes the blatant hypocrisy at the heart of the labor bureaucracy. Working people must be able to have confidence and trust in their unions. And this book is a wedge for anyone working in unions today to help make the changes needed for a stronger and more united labor movement. Dig listeners can get 50% off their first order of this or any book from Pluto Press using the code DIG50 at plutobooks.com. That's capital DIG 50, no spaces, at plutobooks.com for 50% off your first order of any book. The way that woke and DEI are being deployed in the gutting and attempted elimination of USAID, I think, is really fascinating. It's like a revealing window into the intersection of MAGA domestic and foreign policies, because USAID it's a complex entity that does a lot of different things, all of which, though, make it the engine of American imperial soft power. It delivers important life-saving aid, and it also has a long and sketchy history of being a CIA cutout that funds groups that advance U.S. interests within rival countries' domestic politics. And so I've been trying to think about, are they just invoking woke and DEI to gut U.S. aid because that's what they're arbitrarily invoking to justify anything they're doing? And on the one hand, it's like maybe yes, but also I see two different things. On the surface, there are these allegations that the U.S. is spending $100,000 on, I don't know, like transgender theater troops in some third world country or whatever. But then also below the surface, I'm also seeing a MAGA vision, a Trump vision for a new sort of American empire that's all hard power. Is the very sort of soft power that helped underpin U.S. hegemony for such a long time, is that also now woke in DEI in a way that can help us learn something about how they're thinking about both the U.S. and its place in the world?
I think there is something of a new sort of strategic position with respect to this second Trump administration on the question of foreign policy. I would say it represents more the instability of the right-wing coalition that's lined up behind Trump rather than a kind of ideological shift on his part or on his core circle's part. But to the extent that the DEI stuff interfaces with it at all, I think it is, I don't get the sense that it's much more than rhetorical. I don't know that they have a position that soft power is woke so much as they have a position that woke is a useful device for framing things that they want to move away from. But I am curious what people who have dug more deeply into the coalition of right-wing actors on that side of things would make of this particular development. But that would be my guess, just as an outsider looking in.
I don't think that we should underestimate the kind of extraordinary racism of the MAGA political project. And if it means that children starve in the shithole countries, in Trump's parlance, then so be it. I don't think that that is the underlying sort of explanation, but if there's some of that's okay, because that is also part of the terrorizing rollout. I think in some ways this is connected to what is happening within the US, which is tearing up the norms of engagement. It's very thuggish and mafia like. So tearing up the normal modes of engagement to establish new modes of engagement, which is to say that disemboweling US aid is not about the US turning its back on its involvement in the world. It's about finding a new deal, as Trump would say, to have this engagement. But part of establishing the new terms of a new deal is to really show who's the boss, who's in control, and we'll have a deal on our terms, or we won't have any deal at all. So I think that that is part of it. I also think that in some ways the organization USAID was low hanging fruit, which is the easiest aid to get rid of for the American public is foreign aid, because it kind of pushes into the sentiment of why are we helping other people given the conditions of life for people in this country, and just an overall kind of ignorance about anything that goes on outside of this country makes this a particularly attractive target. And it could be, the people who sort of helm the organization. You get to own the libs, Samantha Powers, and, tweet mean things about them in the midst of this. So I think that there's layers and multiple things happening at the same time. I agree with what Femi says, that woke then just is a useful cudgel to beat the organization, its sympathizers, its recipients. It's something to beat them with, even if it's not really the underlying reason. I think all of this is about scaring people, shocking people, and coming back with, in their eyes, a clean slate to do business, whether you're the Federal Workers Union, whether you're a government worker, whether you are a professor, a student, whoever you are, a Medicaid recipient. We're going to do this on our terms, and you can take it or leave it, and we don't care what happens in the interim.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, that there's sort of a globalization of the anti-welfare discourse. And that's not a new thing on the right. It's, the same sort of language used to describe aid to what they would probably call shithole neighborhoods. I think Trump did say something along those lines in terms of Baltimore, aimed at shithole countries. And it's always revealing that Americans, when polled, believe that foreign aid is some giant portion of the federal government, and it's like slightly over 1%, maybe.
Yeah. It's the same with these cuts. If they cut every federal worker that they want to, which, is the vast majority of them, it's less than 1% of the budget. So the whole budget discourse is just, is the entry point into the destruction of many things.
There's a way in which these cuts aren't simply a direct attacks on what we might consider liberal gains or liberal institutions, but are also part of a deregulatory agenda. I'm thinking in particular about the recent news that they cut 1,700 positions at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is the basically the institution for providing oversight on financial services, established and filled with personnel after the 2008 crisis in order to kind of guard against that. Now, in some ways, it's a liberal institution that has kind of given legitimacy to the financial system in the wake of the financial crisis in a way that doesn't actually respond to the fundamental drivers of that crisis. But they're so hell-bent on the complete destruction of their enemies and the complete destruction of the institutions that once gave legitimacy to American liberalism that, they're going after that over what I think most of us would say is not a very significant institution in terms of how we think about the broader risk, safety, and macroeconomic stability of people's lives in the U.S. So I think in some ways they're both driven by this kind of complete destruction of the liberal project, and also by a destruction of these institutions that they think give the liberal project legitimacy, in the same way that they're going after the education department. Right, this education department's promotion of certain types of views of history that they see as being liberal or in some ways leftist. They're trying to break those institutions and create new institutions in which they can formulate a hegemonic program for American conservatism.
And like even more specifically, because I don't know that we've really underlined this yet, there's that line that vulgar Marxism sometimes gets you 90% of the way there. I mean, Musk is invoking woke and DEI to gut agencies that pose and have posed clear regulatory threats to his businesses.
I mean, I wrote about this with the EEOC, right? Tesla has been a kind of hornet's nest of racial discrimination, according to multiple lawsuits, and most recently a class action lawsuit involving upwards of 6,000 Black workers in California. And the way that within days after Trump is inaugurated, that they're doing all their DEI stuff, but two things stood out to me. One is reaching back literally into the era of civil rights to rescind an executive order that had been administered by LBJ in 1965. So, in the heart of the civil rights movement, which the 1776 Commission and conservatives love to herald as a kind of genuine expression of Americana that fundamentally erased racism from the stains of racism from the country, that even that's woke. So the kind of original, it's not the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That'll be next. But the 64 Civil Rights Act is about government itself. This executive order was about federal contractors who work on behalf of the government, which over the last 50 years has become an increasing number of people because of privatization, because of the constant whittling at the edges of the state. It has become much more reliant on private contractors, including Musk, for various projects. And so this EEOC lawsuit was distinct from the class action lawsuit, but was to say that we're suing him because they have created a hostile workplace for Black workers. And so within days, not only does Trump rescind Johnson's executive order about federal contractors having to operate without discrimination on the basis of race, gender, etc., but they go in and defang the EEOC. You need 5 commissioners for a quorum to exist, so they remove 3, so that the organization basically can't exist. And this is just months after, almost 10 months after, on appeal, a court said that this suit from the EEOC could move forward, that Tesla had tried to have it dismissed, and the courts ruled that it could go forward. So this is just kind of appalling undercurrent of corruption, and the Orwellian way, or I've been trying to think about the language. Hypocrisy just seems almost too trite for what is happening.
Or it's like an exhausted concept at this point or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's fraud. It's something more robust where you can have this billionaire who has billions of dollars in contracts with the federal government picking off the regulators that are investigating his businesses for which he is making, I think, Congressman said $8 million a day through these contracts. I mean, this is just naked corruption in the name of weeding out corruption. It's science fiction if it weren't actually happening. This is like an episode of the Twilight Zone for all you youngsters out there who get yourself a 6-pack of episodes and you'll see where this current phase of American history comes from. It is the fucking Twilight Zone.
We touched on the Gaza encampments earlier, and one thing we definitely need to discuss in some detail is how the Israeli genocide in Gaza under Democratic President Joe Biden truly exposed the limits, hollowness, fundamental bankruptcy of purported Democratic commitments to racial justice, the sort of purported commitments on display when, for example, and infamously, Nancy Pelosi led her colleagues in kneeling while wearing kente cloth. Democratic and liberal elites, the very same ones who had been falling all over themselves to insist on their maximal intersectionality, they quite quickly became organized shoulder to shoulder in launching wall-to-wall repression of pro-Palestine protesters, particularly pro-Palestinian faculty and students, a period of liberal repression that's now so clearly greased the wheels for the MAGA attack on higher ed that's intensifying as we speak. Is it enough to say that this was all just bullshit, or is there something more like an imminent critique that would help us elucidate more about what we just lived through?
I mean, I think, it exposed certainly the hollowness of the Democratic Party's commitment to racial justice or anything like that. But I think that there's probably something even more insidious, which is, I think that it exposed the hollowness of their commitment to democracy, which was ironic because they were running on saving democracy. And the attack on the encampments, at its very sort of basic foundation, was an attack on free speech and an attack on the right to assemble and an attack on the right to free political thought. And it's easy to point out the contradiction of J.D. Vance going to Europe and upbraiding the leaders of Europe for suppressing the right of Nazis to speak while having nothing to say about the violent suppression of Palestinian protest. Germany, I think that they banned the use of Arabic protest, and you can't have a Palestinian flag, and there's intense policing of Palestinian solidarity. So nothing said about that. But here in this country, to pose the election as this existential contest between darkness and light, fascism and freedom, while you are leading efforts to distort the political intention of college students primarily, saying that their revulsion at what is happening to Palestinians is anti-Semitic. And then I believe that Biden gave the kind of wink and nod go ahead to up the level of repression in a violent direction by just categorically denouncing the protest, I think it was last May, as violent, which gave the go-ahead to the NYPD to use a SWAT team to break the encampment on campus, but also the building occupation. And so you have this collusion between liberal college administrators and the Democratic Party to suppress speech, to suppress political assembly in the name of defending the regime in Israel and defending the genocide of Palestinians, and then wondering Where's the enthusiasm for the campaign? What's this enthusiasm gap? And then callously running on a theme of joy, trampling on the bodies of Palestinians with this theme of joy and exhibiting such kind of racist contempt that they can't even allow a Palestinian American on the stage of their sacrosanct convention to say one word. And then they wonder and grossly underestimated among their purported base the absolute revulsion and disgust that this generated. Even if this did not become the issue that prevented many of those people from voting, it certainly cast a pall over the entire endeavor that I think ultimately undermined their efforts, because they did look like whatever the word is that is stronger than hypocrisy. They looked like that, telling us that this was a race for democracy while employing the most undemocratic methods in 2 generations to crush a student movement whose crime was raising their voices against historic genocide.
Yeah, I don't think we can understate how utterly cynical and hollow the liberal elites are that dominate the Democratic Party in every instance, not just the student movements, but in the uprisings that we now call Black Lives Matter. There was absolute resistance to both the movements and the demands that were being made by those movements, precisely because those movements were from working class areas that were predominantly people of color, and the demands were principally about those working class areas that were predominantly people of color. It's only after the Democratic Party kind of absorbed the cultural sentiment into their own agenda that they then can pose as, you know, supportive of diversity and anti-racist and all this. But the moment that people of color that are being oppressed, that are on the other side of power, rise up and make demands, they'll slink right back into their typical mode. I think we saw that just with a naked obviousness in the case of the encampments.
So a kind of, let's say, qualified agreement with what Keeanga and Mike are saying, you know, and even the frame of the question. You know, I think a lot of times we imagine the liberal elites in the core of the Democratic Party as people who are committed to progressive goals and ideals, but insufficiently and perhaps incompetently. They don't understand what these ideas and what these goals really demand of them. But I think exactly these developments, the defense of Israel, the attacks on protesters and the uncommitted movement, sat next to the other developments that happened at the same time, the rallying, especially at the Georgia state level, of the Democratic movement against a grassroots movement against Cop City in Atlanta, the ongoing move to the right by the Democratic Party that earned Obama the moniker deporter in chief. No, I think these developments give us reason to frame this a little bit differently. I think there is an element of the Democratic Party, of the core of the Democratic Party, that is just insufficiently committed to progressive goals in a silly way. But there's another aspect of the core of the Democratic Party that I think we need to understand as ideologically committed to these stances. What the Democratic Party has decided to rally in favor of is anti-democratic commitments to domestic repression, to border violence, and to imperial conquest. And those are the values of at least a section of that party. And unless and until other sections of the party or other sections outside of that party force through some kind of political contestation, that section of the party out of power, I think we're going to continue to see the Democratic Party do what it's done over the past decade, which is act as a junior partner to the rise of fascism rather than as an opposition party.
Continuing on the question of Gaza politics, it was really, really notable and clear that supporters of Israel's genocide in Gaza quickly weaponized prevalent forms of liberal identity politics to bolster the legitimacy of Zionism and to demonize and persecute pro-Palestine activists, Zionists and their supporters across all these powerful American institutions. They invoked Jewish student safety, and they rendered opposing genocide and supporting national liberation as a form of anti-Semitism. What can we learn from this perverse inversion and how it took shape and what it reveals about what was always wrong with certain prevalent forms of liberal identity politics?
I have a couple of things to say about this, but I'm interested to hear what Mike Keeanga have to say. So I'm actually just going to say the one thing, which is that the thing I found most striking about the claims to the protection of Jewish students in the move to smear any defense of Palestinian rights as anti-Semitism was the absolute lack of pretense for anything resembling fairness or universality. You know, no one even bothered to say, oh, by the way, those Palestinian students you have, fuck their feelings, right? Because it was from the very structure of the conversations that these people offered in favor of this weird version of identity politics presumed that there was an inherently more important class of students' feelings, that there was an inherently more important class of discrimination. And in a way that both exploits existing problems with identity politics, I think we've all talked about, but the way that it does so is in a way that I think indicts the claims to liberalism of the people employing this strategy. I never thought I would, yearn for the days where people were defending Enlightenment universalism in increasingly hackneyed ways that disguised bigotry. But at least there was the pretense of those kinds of basic aspects of quote unquote rationality and argument. What we have now is some deeper, uglier thing that I don't quite know what to do with.
I think it demonstrates, in fact, the actual cultural change that happened in the wake of Black Lives Matter, and the way in which these ideas resonated on a deep level for ordinary people, ideas that we now think of as wokeness. So one, I would say the discursive move of pro-Israeli organizations and activists was acting in that cultural space. It kind of demonstrates that there was real resonance there. But I also think it was cynical to the extent that wokeness is now dead. The Owl of Minerva type of thing. Are we just talking about something that's actually dead? To the extent that it's dead, these organizations will just use some other thing. They'll quickly kind of pivot to whatever the common sense of the moment is. In some ways, it shows the power of the wokeness kind of narrative, but also the fragility and actually the way in which organizations or activists or individuals, how they justify what they do is just contingent on the moment. And what underlies their actual power and their actual ability to achieve genocide, it doesn't actually have anything to do with that sort of cultural sphere. It's the underlying kind of political and military power that they wield and justify through these narratives. Yeah, and I'm genuinely curious to see where it goes as we get into like a new time. But I have no doubt that these organizations will pivot on a dime if suddenly wokeness and DEI become uncool.
But I do think that this dynamic probably has exposed better than perhaps others the problems with a conceptualization of identity politics that really is purely on identity and devoid of any actual political content. I will say that it hasn't taken Zionist hijacking this particular deployment of politics to bring attention to this. I mean, I do think that there has been attention for a very long time in, I'll just talk about Black politics around the crass deployment of identity to get your way. And so June Jordan has this great interview from 1994 where she's basically talking about the limits of identity politics and just says in a very matter of fact way that I look at what you do and not at who you are. And there's a different kind of politics that is organized around that idea that the politics is more than just your ability to deploy your identity or to say that based solely upon who you are, you know more, you have more to say, that your opinion is more valued simply because of that, not because of the content of what it is that you have to say, but because of the body that you inhabit. There has been a critique of this, and there has been attention around this. Femi should talk about his very wonderful book, Elite Capture, which has tried to kind of elucidate this tension in politics and how identity politics without attention to class, without attention to what he describes as who's in the room, is very different from the progenitors of identity politics. If we want to go back to the Black women of the Combahee River Collective, who were making a much more simpler intervention, which is to say that our issues are being ignored in the existing social movements. No one is talking about Black lesbians. No one is talking about sterilization. No one is talking about violence against working class Black women, not the male dominated Black nationalist movements in the, Black power and the Black liberation era, but also in the spaces of middle class feminism or even amongst radical white feminists. Our agenda is not being taken up. So we're going to call this identity politics. The politics that affect us, we're going to develop a political strategy around because no one else will take them up. And we're going to try to involve other people because we know as Black women, we're about 5% of the population. And so even if these are issues that only affect us, we alone cannot resolve them. We have to be in community, in coalition with other people. That's a very different conceptualization of what, in some ways, right, the movement into the academy and really the academy becoming the place of where these politics get debated, discussed, shaped, formed, and ultimately repackaged into something else. And that's not it's not a moral dilemma. I mean, this often happens. People mean one thing in one historical moment in one period. It's a catchy phrase and it gets usurped. And, you know, 40, 50 years later, it comes to mean something else. That happens. There are certainly limits to that. But I just want to make my only point here is that this particular defilement of identity politics is not the only time that this has come up. As now it's time to critique it. That there has been a long-standing tension around this abuse of identity to capture and pursue a different agenda from what its kind of original political intent was.
Yeah, Femi, as Keeanga just mentioned, you wrote a really excellent book that we discussed here on the podcast about this very question. What about this track record of this sort of identity politics, not just among liberals, but on the left, the broader left that all of us would consider ourselves to be on, a form of identity politics that has had various sorts of prevalence and influence on our broader left that has ranged from annoying to truly damaging, undermining our historic, very serious task of building power to win collective liberation.
Yeah, I actually, the longer I talk about it, the simpler I think it all is at the end of the day, just along the lines that Keeanga was just saying, we can go back into labor history and, find misuses of the basic ideas of class solidarity, right? But no one, for whatever reason, seems to, print out poster-sized photos of people saying workers united for a white South Africa and, make it the basis of their politics that that is what the class struggle really means. People understand and accept that over the course of generations, people will take up ideas, sometimes in ways that are helpful to the broader movement that those ideas came from, sometimes in ways that are neutral and just wacky and weird, and sometimes in ways that are actively injurious to the politics that originated those ideas. And that is just as true about identity politics as it's true of any other sort of identity politics. And the thing that I think is becoming clearer as this particular anti-DEI energy moves forward, the thing that is distinctive about identity politics, if anything, is that there came to be a cottage industry of pointing out this particular kind of co-optation, which I suppose I am part of. But certainly the kind of centrists that were writing about cancel culture for The Atlantic and The Telegraph also were part of. And that anti-wokers on the left also were part of. And I don't think the historians of this period 60 years from now, or if we still have historians 60 years from now. But I don't think historians of this period will think that some deep thing was learned in the course of the struggle over what identity politics really means, or, if it's been co-opted. I think something maybe more insidious and cynical is at the root of all this.
What we have been having over these hours is a nuanced discussion, critique of identity politics in the context of actually existing systems of oppression under American capitalism that include things like racist domination. But in some corners of the left, there's a move to cheer on the right-wing war on woke, hopeful that some sort of universalistic working class consciousness and maybe even socialist politics will spontaneously emerge from the ashes. What are these sorts of arguments from the socialist left missing about what is quite clearly going on right now, and also about how class composition happens?
Well, let me just say that there's a kind of new orthodox Marxism on the American left. And when I say orthodox, I'm referring less to what Marx wrote, more to what folks like Kautsky wrote, Karl Kautsky, who was a German socialist in the early 1900s. And they're kind of building on Kautsky's basic idea about class politics. I'll just say it very simply. Kautsky argued that as capitalism develops, people become proletarianized, they become drawn into common workspaces, and that developmental dynamic of capitalism itself generates this proletarian politics kind of almost automatically. And it thinks about class in this very abstract way, right? You're simply a part of the working class or you're not. Today, nobody would call themselves, well, I guess some people actually do call themselves Kautskyists, but nobody really has that theory in their brains. Instead, today, there's kind of more abstract and static theories about how class politics work that basically argue that capitalism creates constraints on politics. And the overwhelming effect of these constraints is to make it so people don't want to fight back. In that space, then, culture becomes dynamic. It's changing people's ideas, and it's these cultural barriers that exist to class politics, which is why I think there's such an obsession with wokeness. But I think this is this move on the left is really it's really mistaken, and it's really confused, and it's led to a large number of activists and otherwise well-meaning people just really misunderstanding our moment. And I think it's because in some ways, this abstract way of thinking about class, right? I'm a worker, you're a capitalist. These two things that I just said explain everything that I see around me. It misunderstands in some fundamental ways the diversity of class experience. It makes in two basic conflations. It makes a horizontal conflation. It conflates that abstract thing called class with all the different dimensions of class, right? Where you work, like your occupation, if you work in the city or if you work in the countryside. But it also conflates class structure with all the other structures that exist in society, right? Your citizenship, your gender, your like what neighborhoods you live in, all this other stuff. So if we take all that stuff into consideration, it actually suggests to us that the form that class struggle takes is not predetermined by class structure. It takes all sorts of different forms. It's not necessarily workplace fightbacks, although sometimes it is. It's not necessarily electoral campaigns, although sometimes it is. It's not necessarily community or residential riots, although sometimes it is. But the key point is that a dynamic understanding of class actually kind of leads us in the direction of what Stuart Hall called Marxism without guarantees. It kind of leads us in the direction of needing to understand that class politics changes, it's dynamic, it transforms. And so I guess part of my argument, I wrote a paper called The Problem of Class Abstractionism with somebody named Matthew Dessan. And our argument, rather, is that we need to think about class in a slightly different way. We need to have a more dynamic view. And what we put forward is that, in fact, the key dynamic of capitalist development is not this homogenization thing that Kautsky was talking about. It's actually a differentiation thing. It's actually that as capitalism develops, the working class becomes more differentiated within itself. And that differentiation, as that occurs over time, it actually makes salient, it activates, it actually generates, it actually creates the importance of non-class identities and what we would think of as identity politics, right? Or what certain elements of the left would think of as identity politics. I don't like that phrase. I think all politics is identity politics, but that's kind of our perspective. We need to have a more dynamic understanding. And what that actually allows us to do is it allows us to see that these movements that are dismissed out of hand as mere movements of the PMC or just unserious movements of different identity groups who could never link up to a broader class struggle are in fact part and parcel of class struggle. That fight back that occurred in 2020, which Keeanga has written so brilliantly about, was a class struggle. And to the extent that it turned into something else, we shouldn't think about the tail of the process as telling us something about the whole process. To the extent that liberalism was able to co-opt it, it doesn't tell us that, in fact, it wasn't a class struggle. Capitalism was able to co-opt, unions all the time. It doesn't tell us that that's not part of a class struggle and a fight back. I think we're kind of like trying to push folks on the left, and in particular the little sectors that you're talking about, to have a more dynamic view about class and to understand that class is deeply tied into what we would think about as identity.
I'll put this in a slightly different way historically about racism. The American Socialist Party, which was part of Kautsky's international affiliation, the Second International, tried to act out these politics in real life, which essentially meant having a kind of, in some cases, indifferent attitude towards the experiences of Black workers experiencing extraordinary racism in the South and outside of the South, and not really having a theoretical framework to understand what was happening to Black workers. So, in some cases, it meant in the big tent of the Socialist Party, you would have outright racists who were in the party. And then, of course, you'd have the left wing, which was the best of the Socialist Party's tradition, someone like Eugene Debs, who refused to speak to segregated gatherings of workers, who was anti-racist, but didn't really have a political framework to put that into as he continued to operate within the framework of the Socialist Party, which operated under the premise that it's the class struggle that will liberate the working class, and everything else is superfluous to that. And so this politics, in some ways, made sense in the US in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century. But 2 decades into the 20th century, when Black workers start to leave the South, start to leave rural areas, go to southern cities, but then also begin to go to cities in the North, there's a problem. Take 1919, the year that the Communist Party forms, but more importantly, there's a big steel strike in the United States in 1919. And steel bosses would pick up Black workers in the South in trains and literally drive them to the picket line, and the trains would drop them off to break through the picket line and literally take the jobs of the people on strike. And very quickly, within the labor movement and within the left, it became imperative that we actually have to have something to say to these Black workers. Because if the employers are so easily able to just break the strike with the use of Black workers, then they're not just going to do this in this steel strike. This is going to become a pattern throughout. And so, by way of circumstance, the socialist movement realized that they had to have something to say to Black workers, even though their formal theory didn't allow for that. It meant that we actually have to innovate a new thing in our theory to make sense of the material world surrounding us. And they're pushed by Black socialists who are in Black communities, who understand that the experiences of Black workers is different from what is happening to white workers who are oppressed, who are exploited, all true. But there's something additional, something Lenin described as a special oppression, not just being oppressed on the basis of being a worker, but now you have this group of people who are also oppressed on the basis of who they are. So, this is to say that you can have your nice, rounded out theory, but then the world punches you in the face, right? Everyone has a theory till you get punched in the face. And then you have to be able to adapt and do something different. And so the Communist Party, which then forms, understands through the intervention of Black socialists and others that we have to have more to say about what is happening in the working class and in the way that Black workers are being used to not only disrupt labor organization, but the idea that Black workers are inferior also creates its own impediment to the development of a class struggle. The politics of white supremacy create an impediment to joining with other non-white workers. And as more Black people begin to migrate from rural areas into urban areas and become a part of the workforce, this again becomes an impediment to the development of labor organization and to the development of class consciousness, a class again of itself versus a class for itself. And so the socialists had to have something to say, not just to Black workers, but to theorize about how do we overcome this problem. And part of the way that we overcome this problem is by actually challenging racism and fighting racism. Because if we don't fight racism, then how do we ever convince Black workers that they should take our ideas and politics seriously? How do we convince them to come into organizations if those organizations refuse to take the issues that are affecting them seriously? If the organizations have nothing to say about the fact that landlords are charging Black workers 2 or 3 or 4 times what other workers are having to pay, that police brutality, police murder is an issue. And so there's a much longer history around this, but the point is that what was actually happening in real life, in the real world, forced the left historically to have to take up this question of racism. It wasn't because someone was morally enlightened and felt bad for the Black people and, felt that the Black people were just left out. It had become the limits of the socialist, of Kautskyism, of the socialist theory of organizing had been met. That theory could no longer take you anywhere because the world changed. Black people went from being atomized and dispersed throughout rural areas to being concentrated in urban areas and then part of the proletariat. And so it meant that the theory had to change. And this has been with us, the American left, since then. There are more Black people. And now there are Latinos, and after 1965, there are all sorts of non-white people. And a left that is serious can't hide from racism, can't hide from the politics of bigotry and xenophobia. The left has to actually take these up to be able to integrate and include the wide variety of people within the working class. And you can't do that by telling those people that those other issues that you face aren't real. And if we just have this class struggle, that will overcome them, not just because of the Black and brown workers, but the white workers who think they're superior, who think that somehow they're better because they're not Black or brown. Like, those impediments also prevent the development of class consciousness, the development, the shift from being of a class for a class.
I don't have much to add, but I will return to the line I feel I've been pushing underneath the surface, at least for the hour or two that we've been talking, which is, I'll just say explicitly now, we have to understand this weird question of whether quote unquote identity politics ought to fit into the left as a cultural development of our time. We don't need to agree, and we certainly don't need to relitigate every decision of the 19th and 20th century Marxists or socialists or anarchists or leftists. But I don't think this question in this form arose in their time. You can read the correspondence between Lenin and Clara Zetkin, who was part of the SPD and, one of the founders of international feminist movements and organizations. They had lots of debates and disagreements about where the struggle for gender equality fit into the larger left struggle and how to advance it. But they didn't have those arguments or disagreements about whether or not it was properly considered part of the class struggle. In fact, Zetkin even has a quote in her memorandum book where she says social equality for women was, of course, a principle needing no discussion for communists. Marx spent the better part of a decade working for an abolitionist newspaper. He has the famous quote about labor not being able to emancipate itself in a white skin while it's branded in a black skin. The various European socialists and communists and anarchists had discussions about how to fight imperialism and what imperialism meant from the standpoint of capital accumulation, but they didn't have fights about whether it was some other thing other than the class struggle, probably because there were imperialist world wars dividing and reshaping the countries that they lived in, and the idea that imperialism didn't have to do with their political circumstances is not one that would have passed the laugh test in their century. So all this stuff that we're seeing now about whether identity politics is a distraction from the real class politics is a peculiarity of the way people have responded to neoliberalism, and I would suggest a peculiarity of a way people have chosen to overcorrect in response to some less than good ways of talking about race or gender or sexuality or whatever. But the idea that correcting means not fighting for those issues or joining with the right or cheering on the right as they advance the most reactionary chauvinist positions with respect to people's race and gender as some kind of victory for the left is, I think, deeply misguided. And I don't think there's much to say about it beyond that.
Yeah, I really like Femi's, provocation here about how do we understand identity politics as an actual cultural development, or you could even say, how do we understand wokeism as an actual cultural development? I think that's the key question. I'll just put it like that. I think that is the key question for this discussion, because most of the anti-woke left, they don't have any account whatsoever for the development of it. It's just kind of this free-floating cultural phenomena that elites kind of attach themselves to advance their careers, and it kind of is it's kind of like the false consciousness of our time or something. And the actual arguments that are put forward, which are few and far between, are really not very useful. So you have some folks that say it's a result of actual elite overproduction, where we live in a society where we're creating too many elites, and it's just people going to school. They're going to college, and that's how they understand elites. By the way, it's just people with a college degree that do some kind of they're in some kind of creative mental industry, which it turns out is most.
You think these people would be Bourdieuians rather than Marxists?
Right, exactly. That's we should have a podcast on the way that the American left has become Bourdieusian. But even that, it's not a very convincing argument. On the one hand, the vast majority of as more people have gone into higher education, actually there's been a proletarianization of people that leave higher education with a degree. So it's an odd argument. And two, these elite overproduction arguments are classic right-wing arguments. They've gone all the way back to explaining the rise of Marxism. It's why if too many people are going to the university, and this kind of explains these left-wing things. It's just strange that the American left will pick up on something that's been classically right-wing for 150 years. But the other aspect of all this is that I think there's a way in which this embrace or this critique rather, of identity politics or wokeism as the principal barrier to class politics does a kind of double displacement of really meaningful agency in our politics. So on the one hand, it actually displaces working class agency. It displaces the movements that we've been talking about throughout this whole episode that put these issues on the table. It displaces that entirely and instead treats wokeness as it formed over the past 5 years, as it always was from the very beginning. And I think that's just not a very sophisticated way to think. And the second thing is, which I think is as equally as important, it displaces agency from systemic causes of genuine displacement, exploitation, and domination into individual sources. So in our time, for people in this kind of anti-woke milieu, the key villains of our time are people like Robin DiAngelo or Ibram Kendi. Like, these are the people that are actually the source of domination and exploitation. And, while DiAngelo is certainly annoying and certainly cuts against the kind of politics that I want to embrace, of course, DiAngelo isn't the principal actor in systems of exploitation and domination. So I think when you allow this to kind of to center, when you allow these kind of frames to center in your analysis of politics, it leads down some really strange paths. And I think there's a reason why we've seen a cultural convergence between the left and the right on these issues.
Femi Táíwò, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, and Mike McCarthy. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Femi Táíwò, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, and Mike McCarthy. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is the co-founder of Hammer and Hope, a digital magazine of race, culture, and politics. She's also the author of From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, and a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Olúfẹ Táíwò is professor of philosophy at Georgetown University and an editor at Hammer and Hope. He's the author of Reconsidering Reparations and Elite Capture. Mike McCarthy is the Director of Community Studies and Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His most recent book, The Master's Tools: How Finance Wrecked Democracy and a Radical Plan to Rebuild It, was just released with Verso Books. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that economic conditions had first transformed the mass of the people of the country into workers, the combination of capital has created for this mass a common situation, common interests. This mass is thus already a class against capital, but not yet for itself. In the struggle, this mass becomes united and constitutes itself as a class for itself. The interests it defends become class interests. But the struggle of class against class is a political struggle. While other podcasts similarly interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Rio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram at thedigradio, and find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or Spotify, also please rate and review us positively. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really does that is you telling people who might like the pod to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.